Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, my name is Catherine Lyons, and I am the Manager of Policy and Coalitions here at the Economic Innovation Group. I'm joined by my colleagues Rachel Riley, Director for Impact Strategy, and Kenan Fikri, our Director for Research. And we are looking forward to speaking with you today on opportunity zones. This is the first time we've done a webinar like this for kind of local government officials, so we're excited to speak with you all. With that, I'll turn it over to Kenan to kick us off and tell a little bit more about what we do here at EIG and our relationship to opportunity zones, and we will get started. I will be monitoring the chat box, so please feel free to chime in with questions there. Also, everyone should be on mute currently, so if you would like to ask questions in the Q&A portion of this at the end of our presentation, just press *6. And that's the best way to get yourself on mute and ask a question if you'd like to do so verbally versus in the chat box. Finally, I think that's all the housekeeping. Last thing is we are recording this, so we will be circulating a recorded version of the webinar as well as our slide deck to everyone who participated or registered for this. And obviously, feel free to share that with your colleagues or anyone else who you feel like would be interested and would benefit from this information. Thanks again. And with that, Kenan.
Okay, thanks, Catherine, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So a little bit about EIG and why we're doing this. As most of you know, we're a research and advocacy organization here based in Washington, D.C. We were deeply involved with the creation of the Opportunity Zones idea and legislation, and we're kind of the lead outside champion for this in Congress. Since we've kind of been at the center of the storm, trying to stand up an entirely new way of investing in struggling communities, and that involves an advocacy campaign here to try to make sure that the regulations are written in a way that kind of realizes the original vision and intent of everyone who's been involved in this for a long time. And we're also dedicated to informing the stakeholders who need to be activated in order to make sure that this is maximally successful and impactful for the communities it's intended to help. So that means educating fund managers and potential investors on what this is and how it works. It also means educating and empowering local government officials to be knowledgeable actors in this space and to really try to make sure that opportunity zone investments are for their communities and for their residents. We are remaining a resource for you. Feel free to reach out to any of us afterwards. We're a small team, so our email addresses are firstnames@eig.org. And to also just try to stay in regular touch on the latest best practices and developments, et cetera. And then one note on what we're not. We are not a consultant. We're not relationship brokers. We're not in a position to help you find funds or package investments or anything like that. Our role is really purely kind of informational. Okay, so the structure of this is we're going to do a very brief kind of Opportunity Zones 101 because about almost half of the people who registered for this webinar are identified as novices. So the first couple of slides may seem familiar to anyone who's been on an EIG webinar before, but after that we will be getting to the meat of the presentation, which is some kind of best practice and market development updates from the field. So what are the incentives that Opportunity Zone Opportunity Zones offers to investors? So there are 3 reasons that people may, over the coming years, invest in Opportunity Zones with this mechanism. The first is a temporary deferral on their capital gains taxes until 2026. So this means that any investor, and the pool of eligible investors are folks who have capital gains today or are holding investments that they then sell and generate a capital gain. They have to roll that capital gain over into an opportunity fund, and then that opportunity fund, then the investor doesn't have to pay any taxes on that original capital gain until December 2026. So that's the deferral on their original tax bill. Then if they keep their money in opportunity funds and zones for that full period, they'll be eligible for 2 step-ups in bases in the jargon, which essentially means a 10% reduction in that eventual tax bill after they've been investing for 5 years, and then an extra 5% reduction on that tax bill if they've held for 7 years by 2026. The third reason that the third incentive that this new policy offers is an exemption on any capital gains on investments that are made in opportunity zones and that are held for at least 10 years. So this means, investors still have to settle the tax bill from any sale that they use to capitalize an opportunity fund. But if they remain in opportunity zones for the long period, for the long haul, at least a decade, they don't have to pay any capital gains taxes on the investments that they've made in the zone. So of course, that's quite meaningful. That 10-year driver is what's motivating a lot of investors to enter this marketplace, and what is kind of positioning them to be partners of yours for the coming years. Okay, so as you're kind of thinking about your opportunity zone strategy, remember to tend to all sides of the market. So this is, and those 3 sides of, I guess, the market triangle are investors, the pool of potential investors, there are opportunity funds, so these are the dedicated vehicles that will be making investments into zones, and then there's the investments themselves. Those investments kind of fall into 3 different buckets. They can be the stock of a qualified corporation. So these are original issue shares in companies, or shares in companies that an opportunity fund really substantially improves, which means essentially almost doubles the amount of capital that they own. Similarly, it can be a qualifying interest in an opportunity zone partnership. That's really just a different corporate structure, similar to the idea of an equity investment in stocks. And third can be tangible property itself. So buildings, machinery, just really any capital equipment. And again, this has to be either completely new build or new construction or new purchase, or substantially improved. Which means the statute says it has to be 100% of the original basis in the property. The kind of loose rule of thumb is that they have to invest, at least as much in improving the property that they acquire as they paid for it. So that's a pretty steep, substantial improvement test as it's intended to be. And I should note that really this is an equity program, so only equity dollars are incented to move through here. Any lending that investors may bring to bear to close some transactions and deals will not see any tax benefits here. Any cash investments that weren't generated from a capital gain sale will not enjoy any incentives. This is really a mechanism to get resources that are tied up in investments elsewhere today, cashed out, liquid again, and investing in new investments and a new generation of economic activity in places that really need it. Next. Okay, so let's look at the timeline again, because we know that this is an open question for a lot of people, or there's even a lot of active misinformation out there about kind of what is the actual investment window. If you hear from someone that all the action is in 2019, and if you don't get any opportunity zone activity in 2019, the ship has sailed, that is incorrect. There is a really long window here through which opportunity funds will be making qualifying investments in opportunity zones. And really, funds can make investments that get the benefits through the end of the zone designations, which is at the close of 2028. So what does happen at the end of 2019, though, is that the maximum benefits on offer start to fade away. So if you remember, I said there were 2 steps up in bases that allowed you to reduce the tax bill that's due at the end of 2026. The 7-year one kind of passes here at the end of 2019. Still means, though, that investors who get in by the end of 2021 will enjoy a 10% reduction on the original tax bill that's due in 2026. And then even after that, they'll still be able to defer the capital gains. until that date, which has value, of course. But then the 10-year benefit, which is the real motivating factor here, that has a really long tail, and that means that you will even see investors who see OZ investments making sense in 2026, 2027, 2028, come in the market and then hold kind of on a rolling 10-year basis really from there. As long as they sell their assets in zones by 2047, which is what Treasury has put out in the draft regulations, they're eligible for that 10-year benefit. So this is, don't feel like you're behind the game if you're still getting up to speed. Don't feel like it's 2019 or bust because there's a lot of activity that's coming down the pike.
Great.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Kenan. So now we'll talk a little bit about a core piece of this equation, which are opportunity funds. As we note here, they really are the critical intermediary in order to make this work. So as Kenan mentioned, all investments that seek to benefit from the tax advantages here must go through an opportunity fund. That was by design and required in the statute. And essentially what that intends to do is make this really work as a fund that investors are able to hopefully, and we'll get more clarity hopefully with the upcoming regulations, but they should be able to put funds into put investments rather, capital into these funds, and then deploy that capital into a variety of different investments. And so that was really intentional and by design. The model is also meant to encourage, broad participation and pooling risk with multiple investors into these funds in order to, again, kind of make it even more possible for investors to put their capital into these places. The private sector is responsible for starting these funds, so I think that's an important aspect of this incentive. This is not kind of a traditional government program. It's very market-oriented and market-driven. So the private sector will be the ones responsible for setting up these opportunity funds and then deploying the capital into the designated opportunity zones. We have a little bit of clarity as to how opportunity funds become opportunity funds, and that is that they will need to self-certify using a form that has been provided and I believe finalized by the IRS. We have links to that in a slide upcoming. The one requirement, the important requirement that funds must follow is that they must invest at least 90% of their capital into qualified investments in opportunity zones. They will be, as we note here, audited twice yearly to ensure compliance, and essentially will be taken the average of those twice yearly tests to make sure that indeed 90% of their assets are deployed into qualified investments in these places. We're already starting to see the kind of lay of the land shape up in terms of opportunity funds and what they look like and where their focus is. I'll get to that in another couple of slides. But essentially, we're seeing quite a variety. Some are going to be focused nationally, others in a much more specific place. As I mentioned, others will have multiple investors in order to pool their capital and pool their risk. Others may have a single investor. And also others may have a more diverse set of asset classes that they're looking into, while some may focus specifically on businesses or specifically on real estate. This is an example of how we foresee the market maturing, especially as regulations kind of come forth. Treasury is working on that as we speak, and I'll get to a little bit more of that as to what we've seen so far with the regulations and the second round we're expecting imminently. But as those come through, we expect the market to mature kind of in this way. Right now, we're seeing a lot of single investor, single asset type funds. That's because it's kind of the simplest model and the most straightforward way to approach opportunity zones at the moment, given the regulatory framework. But we anticipate, and certainly this program, or this incentive rather, was designed to have multiple investors investing either in one specific project or business and then eventually into multiple. And so there are some critical questions there that need to be answered in order to make sure the kind of last column there comes to fruition. But that's certainly the intention from Congress and why opportunity funds are sort of the critical intermediary here. So in terms of the landscape I was mentioning previously about how this is looking, there are a couple of resources, one of which we linked here, that are starting to track some of these funds. Right now, the Novogradac, which is an accounting firm based out of San Francisco and has been really leading the charge on a lot of this work related to opportunity zones and developing a lot of resources. So in general, I highly recommend looking at their site often for important updates. As well as ours, of course. Got to plug our stuff. But they have put together a Opportunity Zones fund listing. Right now, this is all an opt-in, in terms of the resource. So it's not necessarily comprehensive. Funds have to kind of list their work here voluntarily. But even with that, we're seeing that 87 funds are now seeking more than $20 billion for Opportunity Zones investment. So it's exciting to see some real early market action here. The second here, the National Council of State and Housing Agencies also has more than 100 funds on their site. That's a great resource to see the types of assets that funds are looking into, as well as the amount of capital that they're hoping to raise. Some interesting funds that we wanted to mention here in terms of ones that we think may be particularly applicable to this group based on some of your survey responses. The Rural Colorado Opportunity Fund is again focused, as the name suggests, on rural communities in Colorado and some of the real estate and business opportunities there. The Emergent Communities Fund is in partnership with Enterprise Community Partners, a large CDFI, and they are working on investing in businesses in kind of Main Street America in the Southeast, I believe. Great. And finally, an exciting one that just came online with the help of an Opportunity Zones incubator that's being funded by the Kresge Foundation, the HBCU Opportunity Fund. So this is a fund that will specifically develop some, I think right now at least, real estate opportunities, residential as well as commercial mixed use properties in and around historically Black colleges and universities. So that's, again, exciting to see some of these funds emerge that do have an impact and a community-centric mindset to them in terms of the types of assets that they're hoping to invest in and the capital that they're planning to deploy. Finally, some states are creating their own platforms to better track funds and fund activity that is happening there. Colorado and Maryland are both linked there. Just want to call out Maryland for a pretty sophisticated site that they've ended up developing. And we'll talk a lot more about Maryland in terms of some of the other practices that they're employing in their state. But this is certainly one of them, and one that we've been seeing a lot of states talk through is, providing a place for both investors to look and see what projects are available, shovel ready, or at least being prioritized by other communities, and connecting investors with those types of projects. So that's exciting to see as well. So I think probably a question that's on many people's minds is what is going on with the regulation and the regulatory framework. So this is a lot of text here, but hopefully you can kind of reuse this as a resource. The first round of proposed regulations was released by Department of Treasury on October 19th. So the public had about 60 days, or they did have 60 days to issue comments on the regulations. EIG definitely submitted comments alongside about 170 other people who also submitted comments. So Treasury has quite a lot to go through. But I think there were some definitely unifying themes amongst the concerns or the support for what Treasury did do. And I'll talk through a few of these here. So in terms of what they did do and what was helpful is that they did clarify some pretty kind of simple or straightforward rules on partnerships, the types of funds and the types of gains that are eligible for the benefit. So really some of those kind of foundational issues were addressed in the early round of regulations. They also defined substantially all. So I think Kenan mentioned that in order to qualify as an Opportunity Zones business, you have to have substantially all of your tangible property located in the zone. In the statute, that wasn't defined, but the proposed regulations now define that as 70%, which hopefully provides businesses some flexibility in pursuing that qualification. There's also some clarification around the substantial improvement test that we mentioned earlier. Again, the statute requires the doubling of original basis there, but the proposed rules have that for building only and not including the value of the land in the calculation of that basis. So we need some additional clarity still, and this is particularly relevant for investment in operating businesses. Again, some of the real estate, there's certainly some important questions that still need to be answered, but a lot of these questions really pertain mostly to investment in operating businesses. So the first is the 50% gross income test. In the statute, it talks about the fact that in order to be a qualified business, that business must have 50% of its gross income come from the active trade or conduct of a business. That is essentially meant to ensure that any business that's being invested in is actually generating economic activity in the zone. They're not just kind of a patent box or a PO box that's just sitting there, but rather they actually are conducting, active business there. What Treasury added was a geographic requirement that 50% of gross income must come from the active trade or conduct of a business in the zone, which obviously limits a lot of businesses, to a small census tract, whereas, many businesses these days are selling their goods and services online or certainly outside of the boundaries of a tract. So we're looking for additional clarity from Treasury to hopefully provide more flexibility there for businesses. We talked a lot about some kind of definitions like original use and substantially all and substantial improvement. While Treasury has provided at least some clarity on some of these, there's also still a lot to be defined, further defined, especially, substantial improvement for an operating business. What does that look like? It's pretty clear or more straightforward for real estate, but less so for how a business can substantially improve or double their basis. So that's something that we're looking for. And finally, we're looking for a lot more clarity on timing for qualified opportunity funds for both the investment and the reinvestment. Right now, funds have to deploy their capital within 6 months of standing up, which is certainly an accelerated time frame, especially for those that are trying to deploy capital into portfolio of operating businesses. So that's something that we'd love to see a little bit more flexibility on, or at least clarity in, the fund's kind of first year of, being on the market. So in terms of the second round of guidance, this is the question that we get probably most often, is when are the second round of regulations coming? Great question, and we hope that the answer is within a few weeks. So actually just of this week, there's been some movement here. The regulations have officially left Treasury and have gone to the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs over at the Office of Management and Budget in the White House. So that is the kind of last step before publication on the Federal Register. Last time in the first tranche of regulations, they stayed there for a couple of weeks or a few weeks. So we're anticipating and hopeful that the regulations will be publicly released in April, which would likely kick off another comment period. Again, last time it was 60 days. We'll see what they do this time. And again, I want to clarify too that the first round of regulations are not finalized. They are still proposed regulations. And these will be the same. So we do not have any kind of final regulatory guidance yet. Just hoping for the next tranche of proposed regulations. And then we also anticipate probably seeing a third tranche, which will focus more on anti-abuse provisions and the decertification process. Our best guess as to what the second round of regulations will include are listed there. But again, that's kind of a best guess based on what is included in the on the federal government's website at the time. All right.
Okay. This is back to Kenan. So thanks, everyone. Now, a little bit about zones themselves before we get into activity that's starting to pop up in some of them. Now, as many of you know, because you were involved in the designation process, the map of the country's opportunity zones is set. There are over 8,700 of them if you include Puerto Rico, almost all of which is an opportunity zone in its case. And There are no windows really for swapping zones. There's no planned redesignation window. Really, the map of your opportunity zones is the map that you should assume you're working with for the next 10 years. Going forward. If we go to the next slide. Okay. Yeah. So what do the opportunity zones look like? They are essentially, the cohort of opportunity zones exhibits more need across really every metric that we look at, be it employment, be it poverty rates, be it median family incomes, et cetera. Then not just the national set of census tracts, but also the cohort of census tracts that were eligible but not nominated. So the opportunity zone slice of America is one of the neediest kind of slices that you could come up with, which is a really I think speaks volumes for the kind of embrace of federalism that Congress chose to use in the zone designation process here to allow states and localities really broad discretion in identifying their priority low-income communities for investment. You can see, the bulk of opportunity zones fall between about a $30,000 and $50,000 a year median family income. There's a small tail of zones towards the right-hand end of the chart that are not as needy as others, that are getting kind of an outsized share of press attention. So one thing that we're dedicated towards and encouraging everyone to do is really focus on the bulk of opportunity zones and what these places need in order to make the most of this incentive, because that's where we're really going to drive change in communities, and that's those are the places that really need your attention and all of our help and resources. So that's a little bit on the map. This is probably the map that you are less familiar with, but more excited to see. So just a peppering of a sample of some of the early deals that we've seen come down the pike here so far in late 2018 and early 2019. And we should say that there's a lot of activity that's not public yet, is private, happening on the sidelines, and may yet become public soon after there's a little more regulatory clarity. But so far, some of the ones that we'd like to highlight really show the range of applications that opportunity funds have found. And I think this is really important as you think of your own strategy. Opportunity zone financing is going to be eligible to invest in all sorts of things in your community. It's not just affordable housing. It's not just startups. It's that and it's brownfields, it's historic preservation, and this equity tranche of capital should be able to do or get really anything that you want it to in your communities, as long as it's a qualifying investment. So what are some examples? So one, East Chicago, there was a 400+ acre brownfield site. It was an old DuPont chemical site that had been condemned as a hazardous waste site, completely unoccupied for 25 years now. And thanks to Opportunity Zone Capital and an EPA Superfund grant, it is now going to be reconverted after a lot of public effort and a lot of years of idleness into a logistics hub there in East Chicago, Indiana, near Gary. So that's a great example of kind of a brownfield conversion that's really exciting to us, and I think exciting to many of the especially city focused people on the call, just because the economics of those projects are so marginal. Another one in similar spirit is in Baltimore, Maryland, called Yard 56. Here, Prudential came in with an OZ equity tranche of capital that was able to close a deal that people had hoped would transpire for several years now in East Baltimore, kind of connecting to two neighborhoods that themselves had been severed by quote unquote urban renewal and the highway infrastructure there in East Baltimore, and bringing a sense of cohesion back to those neighborhoods, also anchored by a satellite campus of Johns Hopkins University there. So that's exciting. We've seen in some rural areas, so take Heflin, Alabama, in the northeastern corner of the state there. An old high school is being reconverted into a senior care center. This is local capital, a local investor, who found out that Opportunity Zone program was coming down the pike, was able to realize a capital gain and redeploy the money in this. And we've heard anecdotally from a number of other communities actually that this kind of rural senior care model may end up being a thing. So watch this space. We've also seen sawmill conversion in Vicksburg, Mississippi. This was highlighted in the President's State of the Union address. We've seen Main Street refurbishments, just normal Main Street shops being rehabilitated, reaching that substantial improvement test, and revitalizing kind of small town downtowns as well. One really exciting one recently from Charlottesville, Virginia. Habitat Humanity had acquired a large tract of land that was currently a mobile home park. They're able now with Opportunity Zone capital to convert this space into a new kind of mixed-use development, have affordable apartments and housing upgrades for the long-standing tenants and residents, and they're also combining it with small business and entrepreneurship support spaces to allow some of the people who used to occupy those mobile homes to become entrepreneurs and pilot businesses and storefronts. And then we see a mix of affordable housing and mixed-use things coming down the pike as well. Yeah, so these are, to close before handing it over to Rachel, just some of my key impressions from a year and a quarter of activity so far. Really, all action and impacts, et cetera, is local. So there's a lot on your shoulders right now, which is I think should be good news. But first, a couple comments on what does the market look like so far? First, the investor base is broad. Really, anyone who has a capital gain is eligible, and anyone who has capital gain seems to be interested. So this goes the gamut of the financial sector to individuals, entrepreneurs themselves, VC investors, really some corporations as well. That I'd say, there is not one type of OZ investor here. It's a new class, which is exactly what the legislation intended to do. It intended to draft more people kind of into the business of community development, either wittingly or unwittingly. Second, it seems that Opportunity Zones, generally does change the economics of many types of investments. It makes things that were promising before but couldn't quite close the deal actually come to fruition, and that's exciting. It won't make a bad investment good, but it can get many investments over the finish line, and that's to the third point. Really often serves as a deal closer, and it joins the capital stack of a lot of different other types of financing too. Then local capital is likely to move first, and I think this is really important. Back on that first slide, I think I said you need to be tending to all sides of the market here. This means that if you're only trying to come up with your prospectus and only trying to package your sites as prettily as possible, I really don't think you're doing enough. You need to try to coax an investor ecosystem into being, or draft your investors into or behind Opportunity Zones to really make sure that awareness is there and that you can influence and steward what this investment does in your communities. And it also means you're not competing as directly with other localities for investment dollars that are already in your community, and I think it's a different exercise than trying to get the attention of the New York or California-based investor and hoping that they see gold in your deal. So want to really drive that point home, and also so we did a very brief, simple look at how much capital gains are in different states using a proxy of. I think we got 2016 data on individual tax returns, and saw that even in take West Virginia, in that year, individual taxpayers realized over $6 billion in capital gains. That is, of course, a really small and very poor proxy for unrealized capital gains, which is really the stock of wealth in a place. But it shows you that there is a significant flow of potential capital in all corners of the country at all times, and you should be aware of that. Okay, now, as Catherine was mentioning, the operating business side of the market is mostly frozen pending regulations, and that's unfortunate for those of us who really see a lot of the excitement in this policy as potentially catalyzing, new crops and cohorts of entrepreneurs in places that really need them. But it also means that over the course of this year, we should see a gradual thaw in that side of the market, and then in other spaces too that just need a little more and time to figure out what the business model is. I'd put clean energy under there, some forms of agriculture, et cetera. So what you see now is indicative of, or is not indicative, sorry, of what a fully regulated, mature market's going to look like. This is just kind of the easiest stuff coming online now. Local leadership is really fundamental. Rachel's going to tell you a lot about the different things that you can do. But one thing that we've noticed is that philanthropies and nonprofits and other entities who care about these communities and have been active in them for a long time don't quite yet know what they should be doing, and they want cities to tell them because you guys are the credible brokers of need and kind of just the representatives of the people that they are trying to reach. So I'd be very frank. If you need a staff person dedicated to opportunity zones, tell that to your community philanthropy and ask them to try to fund the position. If you need to make sure that certain a daycare center goes in here, or that there's a workforce training program to connect people to investments that are coming down the pike, just tell that to people who kind of are on the sidelines right now and looking how to engage constructively but aren't quite sure. Then your role is also going to be really important in charting the vision for what you hope Opportunity Zone Capital can accomplish in your communities over this decade-plus time horizon on which the incentive works. Investors are not that great at seeing beyond their individual project and individual term sheet. So I think that you'll be able to really shape the market locally and coax more capital out of investors if you're thoughtful on what you what this community is going to look like 10+ years down the road and what the ultimate return is going to be for them. The prospectus exercise is part of that, but I think you can go a long way to do more as well. And then lastly, don't neglect the indirect impacts and opportunities here. For example, even if the regulations on the operating business side of things don't come out as we hope, there will be many new opportunities for entrepreneurship in these communities just as the economic facts on the ground change. As a new mixed income apartment building goes up across the street from a kind of mom and pop retail stretch, there could be roles for CDFIs or for cities to try to offer those business owners grants to refurbish their facilities or upgrade and move into some of the new office spaces created elsewhere. And as foot traffic increases, et cetera, I think that you should be having a complementary strategy for how are you going to connect people to the new opportunities and the new market activity that OZs generate, not just how are you going to make sure that they are direct investees of OZ equity capital. And that's about all I have to share, so passing it over to Rachel.
Yeah, thanks, Ken, and thanks, Catherine. So this is Rachel Riley. Before I get started, I just want to provide a little bit of background about who I am, where I came from, because I'm newly minted at EIG as of last month. And looking at the RSVP list, I know that there's a few of you that I was working with over at my old company, which was Enterprise Community Partners. So just want to make sure that everyone knows that I'm not a guest speaker today. I'm actually over at EIG full time. So very excited to be here. I am doing a lot of the same work that I was doing at EIG or at Enterprise, now at EIG. So really trying to build awareness throughout the nation. I'm on the road a lot, talking with communities, and ensuring that any recommendations that we're elevating are grounded in truth and that I can continue to elevate a lot of the needs that I'm seeing around building capacity in local communities and educating the capital markets about the importance of working with local partners, including local government, as well as local community leaders writ large, around the need for them to work with you to make their investment decisions. So with that said, I will start my slides, which first I want to start talking about the emerging landscape across the nation. So again, I've been on the Opportunity Zone Roadshow for the past year, which I've completely enjoyed and enjoyed meeting so many folks. And how I would bucket this out as far as what I'm seeing are, there's a lot of initiatives happening. There's some capital solutions. some emerging policies, as well as some resources that I wanted to point folks to. And I included a lot of links here so I can roll through this information really quickly, but you guys will have this in the future to refer back to. So as far as initiatives, I'm seeing some third-party entities step up to do ecosystem building. So a lot of the work that otherwise would be happening by the states, conducted by the states or cities, there's some cities or states that have chosen to defer or deputize third parties to do that on their behalf. So where I'm seeing this done really well is in Alabama with Opportunity Alabama. We're seeing a lot of cities create what are being referred to as a prospectus, which is basically a marketing document. So it's not an offering memorandum or anything like that. That's a security. It's a marketing document that really, I think, plants a flag in the sand to indicate to investors that you are open for business, that you want to attract investment from Opportunity Zone motivated investors. And it also, to some extent, lists investable deals, so community priorities that have been identified that investors can diligence and take a look at. One of the things that I'm really excited about and I want to share with you is when I was in Miami a few weeks ago, I met with the local legal services of Greater Miami, and I think that this is a great model to be working with the local legal service provider as an OZ quarterback. We're seeing a lot of communities and community stakeholders need technical assistance around legal questions and accounting questions, and working with your local legal aid or legal service provider that is used to working with the community in this capacity, I think is a really great way to do that. We're seeing technology platforms to connect investors and opportunities emerge. One of the links I provided there is OpSites, which is the back office or the third party that the state of California is using. There's also Opportunity Exchange, which I'll go into later. The other thing that I'm seeing is an impact framework I want to share. This is really exciting. It's something that I worked on when I was over at Enterprise, and it's something that EIG was a partner on as well. But the Federal Reserve in New York, as well as U.S. Impact Investing Alliance and the Beck Center at Georgetown, really led the way to create what I would call a private sector approach to measuring impact. And so please go on that website and check out the impact framework that they've come up with and shopped around, and it's gaining a lot of traction, and folks are really excited about it. As far as capital solutions, this is the way that I would describe capital solutions are, how are third parties or public sector leaders coming to the table to help support community actors and others in establishing funds or creating plans. And so, Colorado was a real early leader on this. I want to tip my hat to Chantal in Colorado. I don't know if she's on, but I'm just going to brag on her anyways because she did such a wonderful job leading this. But early on, she and Jeff and a lot of others over in Colorado decided that they needed to find funding to support technical assistance for community leaders that wanted to create plans or create funds for opportunity zones. So that way, it was empowering them to meet investors and say, this is how we want to mold the opportunity zones environment in our community. And so that was the public sector approach. And then we're seeing philanthropy come to the table to some extent with this Kresge and Calvert Impact Capital, which was mentioned earlier, the incubator that they did. And why that's really critical is that it pooled back office resources, so legal and accounting, so that technical capacity that a lot of these fund managers would have had to outsource individually, and it pooled it to maximize efficiency there. And so that they shared that resource as they explored whether or not they wanted to become a fund manager and then structured their fund. And that was critical to, as Catherine mentioned, launching one of the first funds out of that incubator. Some policies that we're seeing are both city and state opportunity zone task force. In Maryland, the task force that was created in January is really responsible for convenings, aligning state resources and priorities around opportunity zones, as well as working with local governments throughout the state. And in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, we were speaking with the council member that really is leading the way there in Pine Bluff, and he's just, you know, so wonderful. And he was sharing his process for drafting and getting the resolution passed to create this task force. And really it's about involving local stakeholders in Pine Bluff to create a framework that'll help guide how Pine Bluff identifies its investable assets and moves forward with their opportunity zone plan. We're seeing tax credits being introduced in states, as well as this question of whether or not states are going to conform with IRC. I know that a lot of questions have come in around conforming with IRC. I want to refer to the Novogradac website for time's sake, because I think that Novogradac's done a really great job of explaining this issue and has maps on their website of which states are conforming, both on the corporate side as well as the personal income side. And I just wouldn't do it justice if I try to do it in the short time that we have, or at all, really. They're the experts, so please go to that website. Another thing is exemption of income taxes for QOZ businesses. This is something that West Virginia has proposed through state legislation. So they said, you know, if you're a QOZ business, there's the potential for 10-year exemption of income taxes. So that's trying to attract business into their state. In Mississippi, we saw a 12.5% set aside for tax credit financed housing. So 12.5% of their LIHTC allocation over the coming years will go towards opportunity zones. In Missouri, we saw a $30 million set aside for their state historic tax credit. And we're also seeing states like Maryland align state resources, as well as states contemplate regulatory relief. So regulatory relief is something where if you don't want to think about foregone tax revenue, or you don't have capital to appropriate, regulatory relief still gives you somewhat of a competitive advantage by making it more attractive investment environment for developers or for investors, but also encouraging certain activities like building affordable housing if you're doing things like fast tracking permitting processes or altering the requirements for environmental review, like is being contemplated with CEQA in California right now. Some resources at the bottom. I really encourage you to check those resources out. The NOAC Metro Finance Lab, that is Bruce Katz. He's the director there. So if you're reading, what cities should do to maximize opportunity zones, what states should do to maximize opportunity zones, that's what that is right there. And then I know prior to the webinar, we did some key concerns, or we did some polling around what you wanted to hear about. So we didn't want to do polling for the sake of polling. We wanted to be responsive to that. And the three things that we're hearing are, what is the environment with OZ and rural communities? What's happening with community wealth building? And also, can you speak a little bit about displacement and concerns there? So investment in rural communities, one of the potential solutions or bright spots that I want to point to there was the White House Opportunity and Revitalization Council that was established through an executive order in mid-December. Where I think that could potentially be helpful for rural communities is that there's 13 agencies within that council, and if the programs that come out of some of those agencies can be aligned with rural OZs, it can lay the foundation for investors to be incented or to attract investors to rural communities, and to some extent alter investor decision-making processes. So, for example, some of that could be like infrastructure improvement. So if you're thinking rural communities, if there's a program or a grant to improve broadband in a rural community, that may encourage an investor to invest in a rural community but for that investment not happening, they may not have considered it. Same with infrastructure improvement, with roads, really anything infrastructure related I think is going to be important, as well as workforce training. If there's workforce training paired with any sort of HQ contemplated move to a rural community. I think that that's sort of a game changer, as well as any complementary debt products or credit enhanced debt products that could be provided aligned with OZ equity. Those sorts of things could be game changing for investor decision making around whether or not they go to a rural community. But we're also seeing some really good initiatives around education and outreach. So I want to point to the Utah Association of Counties and Sorensen Impact Center partnership. This partnership is going around throughout the state of Utah, educating, building capacity, and as well as the community exchange in Minnesota. Check out their OZ Challenge. They're doing the same thing as far as building capacity and education, but they are actually hosting a challenge where they're asking people to submit their projects, and they're not saying these have to be perfect projects, just throw them up on the OZ Challenge, and then they're going to be judged, you know, thoughtfully and kindly judged, but they're going to be judged, and at some point in June, there's going to be a winner. And so this is kind of a way of aggregating projects throughout the state of Minnesota, but then identifying deals for investors. And a lot of that is happening throughout rural Minnesota as well. Community wealth building. Oh my goodness. I want to emphasize that site control of land is key. A lot of activity right now is happening with real estate, and I cannot overemphasize how important having site control of land is today and will be moving forward. One of the things that I think folks on the call should consider is if you don't already have a rapid response land acquisition facility, so some debt facility or impact facility that stakeholders could tap into to compete with the private market, I would really recommend that that be something you look at. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be for OZ-related activity. It could just be in an opportunity zone. Ideally, it would be for OZ-related activity, but that way you could help the community come to the table in a way where they're preserving land for community wealth building. Two examples are included right there of existing acquisition funds or facilities that have been successful. But, you know, we really think that the true potential for wealth creation is through business investment. And I want to point to a Forbes article that highlighted an incubator co-working space called Launchpad. So you can read more about that. But as we mentioned, we really do need more clarity from the IRS before that market's going to move. You know, Ken mentioned it, that it's frozen for all intents and purposes, and I couldn't agree more. And then finally, I think one of the things that we have to continue to emphasize is this need for pre-negotiated exits from opportunity funds. And so on both the business and real estate side, ensuring that all parties know at the front end what the exit strategy looks like to ensure that we're retaining any you know, benefit or acceptable level of benefit in the community at exit. So, and I'm saying acceptable level of benefit because that just has to be, you know, determined by the parties at hand. And then the third is displacement. And I know that this is a concern for folks. And so what I really want to underscore is that you guys are really empowered through your city-owned property, and so both land and actual buildings, to preserve and create affordable homes and workspace, and would encourage folks to do that to the extent that that's available to you. And I did say affordable homes and workspace. I think the workspace piece is going to be really critical. In some cities, they're looking at how do you create a sustainable revenue stream through impact fees that go beyond the opportunity zone or other streams of revenue to capitalize an anti-displacement fund. And the fund could be used for different uses, so it would have to be informed by community needs or local needs. And then there's always, you know, the toolkit of your existing policies, so tax abatements, inclusionary zoning, right of first refusal, whatever makes sense for your local community, that's what I think your best strategy is. But Kenny, can you help me? I always forget the number. We did a study on this around the census tracts that have experienced gentrification over the recent years. Do you remember what the percentage of opportunity zones is?
Percentage was about 4% of opportunity zones.
Okay.
Yeah, show the telltale signs of gentrification. But also, point of the report is that it's really hard to measure. So it's kind of you know it when you see it. But even then, a number of those communities still had like really high vacancy rates, for example. So how do you channel investment towards underutilized sites or infill things first in those communities? So.
Yeah, so it's such a nuanced issue from community to community, and I know it's something that is a priority for us, and it's something that we're going to continue to keep our eye on over the coming years for sure. Thing that I want to share and just really quickly is because data collection and investment transparency has been key is just some resources here. So of course the data collection form for the IRS, the Opportunity Zones framework linked to that, and then the Opportunity Exchange platform, which is the platform that's going to connect investors with deals, but really puts impact up front. It uses the Opportunity Zone framework in order to help investors communicate and understand the impact that they're having in communities by predetermined metrics that can help them quantify that, and also sources deals that align with community priorities and needs. So that's really exciting, and I know a number of communities and initiatives have started to adopt that Opportunity Exchange platform, including Opportunity Alabama.
And we should also just note that you all are in power as well to set up your own reporting framework, especially if you're granting permits, if you're putting your own city dollars behind projects. You can use that commitment as leverage to get information. So we would encourage you all to do that too. The federal government is going to come out with its kind of data reporting and tracking framework later this year and solicit public comment on that, but there's nothing preventing you all from moving as well. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, in fact, we're already seeing some legislation come out at the state level around this as well. Maryland, again, kind of leading the way on introducing some legislation that pairs some additional incentives at the state level with that kind of impact reporting. So I know that we are at the top of the hour already. I have a few questions that I've written down from the chat box, but just a couple of logistical notes for those who may have joined a little late. We will be sending around the slides with all of the links after the webinar, so probably sometime tomorrow. This is also being recorded, so we will send around the recording of the webinar. And again, feel free to share this information with anyone who you feel like would benefit. With that, I will also include our email addresses, so feel free to contact us if you have any questions about anything that we've included here. But with that, we'll turn it over to questions. I'll first answer the ones that I saw in the chat box, and we're willing to stay on for a few minutes. I know some folks have to hop off, but we're happy to stay on for a few minutes to help answer these questions. If you would like to ask them over the phone, it's just *6.
Please also let us know, as Catherine does follow up, let us know if this was useful, what from the model was good, not good. Again, as she mentioned at the outset, this is the first time we're doing this. We've sensed that there's demand, and just want to, would love any feedback that you have as well.
Yeah,
Thank you.
This will not be the last time. So yeah, as we can improve, that will be helpful. All right, so the first question I have here is related to what's the financial incentive for nonprofits? So of course, most nonprofits likely do not have kind of capital gains, the type of capital that's required in order to benefit from this tax incentive. But I think we talked a little bit about philanthropy and the important role that they can be playing in communities, and of course the kind of long-standing role that they've had in these communities, and therefore the expertise and community-centric knowledge they can bring to a lot of these investment strategies and of course kind of local strategies in order to attract investment to the right types of projects. But
yeah, and the one thing that I would add is that I hope nonprofits, especially CDFIs and CDCs that are used to doing investments in communities, think about this as a potential new revenue stream for them. So what can they be doing to and identify and a role, or a small B broker role? I think that there's real money to be made there, and I hope that folks are exploring that.
Yeah, and I'll just add that nonprofits can be co-investors, and through their co-investment, just like the public sector does it, they can use that leverage to kind of extract or good outcomes or shape the outcomes that they want to see. So I think yeah, that's really important. And then CDFIs too, in particular, they have informational capital, which now may be really valuable. They know these communities, they know what investments are good, what investments are going unfunded, and now there's more demand for that information. So I think that being kind of the boots on the ground, even informal broker role is really important too. So,
yeah. And kind of maybe your second point actually takes is a nice segue into the next question, which is related to the 90% requirement for funds in terms of investing that into qualified opportunity zone property, and whether that's a requirement, if that fund does indeed have a different types of capital in it. So for example, if it does have kind of debt financing as well as equity, that is certainly okay, but the 90% asset test is really applicable only to the funds that would be eligible for the tax incentive. So that's the equity capital gains, or the equity investment of capital gains into the opportunity fund. So that's again where that particular test applies. Just seeing a couple of questions related to the regulations. I'll say again that we are hopeful that this second round of regulations will have a lot more clarity related to, opening the door for business investments or investments in operating businesses. Again, that's just a kind of hopeful report right now. We don't exactly know what that will entail, but again, we hope to see those in the next few weeks. And then one more here that I just saw come through about how can opportunity funds be established in rural communities. So again, opportunity funds need to be kind of established by the private sector. So really courting kind of those investors. And again, I think we were thinking about people who are from places, from those communities are going to be kind of the low-hanging fruit of people to really target. Who have a dedicated kind of stake in those communities and may want to put their capital, or keep their capital at home. But there is kind of, this is not, a government will not be coming in and creating funds. This is very much a kind of a market-oriented private sector approach with that regard. And in terms of who manages it, I think we're seeing a lot of different fund structures kind of come into play. Obviously, there's a lot of fund managers who will be doing the kind of management of the investments and of the funds, but it's very dependent on the type of institution or even the individual. I mean, individuals can also start opportunity funds, so it really can be, and it's meant to attract a kind of a broad and a diverse set of investors, not just sort of the large financial institutions that have been traditional investors, in community development. But I think, as Ken had mentioned, this is meant to kind of broaden the scope of who's involved in community development to a much, kind of wider scale. So I don't know if you have anything else down on that. But.
Yeah, no, not too much, but I'll opine anyway. Yeah, so all you really need is an investor and an accountant. We're seeing, yeah, so many of the opportunity funds that have popped up so far have just a couple investors who often have experience working together. So there's kind of high trust that bridges them right now through all the regulatory uncertainty in the environment. But as we have clarity on exactly, how funds are governed, what happens when funds buy and sell assets within the 10-year window, et cetera, we'll be able to see more arm's length relationships pop up and almost more kind of mutual fund style or more like retail investors just put their money into a pot and then be part of it, but not really actively involved in what investments are being made. And then we also have seen a couple crowdfunding models pop up as well. So it'll be a big variety.
Yeah. Great. And I think the last kind of set of questions were at the very top of the hour, actually, related to opportunity zone funds and how this could work for residential development, given the kind of long tail of investment required. So I don't know if you all have thoughts on that, but yeah, that is more of a challenge, obviously, with wanting to kind of sell, homes quickly after the development. But I don't know if you have more questions related, or more answers rather.
Yeah, I think that that's one of the reasons why addressing the interim gains issue that we continue to talk about is going to be key. So of course, doing something like single family homes in rural communities is so important, and everywhere, to be quite honest. But because you as a builder don't want to be a 10-year owner in a home, you want to be taken out by a mortgage basically right after you're done building this home. You want to be able to recycle that capital back into your fund. But right now, we're still waiting on rules to see whether or not recycling that capital back into your fund is going to negatively impact the tax benefit and how it's accrued to investors. So if it doesn't negatively impact the accrual of the benefit to investors, that'll be a positive thing, and we may be able to creatively structure around that. But if it does impact it, I think that we're still going to need to creatively structure around it, but the models are going to be fewer and far between.
For now, rental's fine. It's the questions around for sale, residential.
It would also be great to have IRS explicitly state that residential is eligible use, because I know that was another question or another issue. It's inferred, and it's also generally accepted based on what's happening in the market right now, but it's not explicitly stated anywhere.
Okay, I think that is most of the questions. The last one I see here is, how often will opportunity zones change? So I think that might be a reference to the designation of the actual zone. I think as kind of mentioned previously, designations are through the end of 2028. So it was a 10-year designation. At this time, we don't see any kind of movement on redesignating or adding more zones or anything at this point. So as far as we know, the zones are locked in until the end of 2028, at which point we very much hope that there will be a reauthorization, and we will get to do this all over again.
Yeah. And if there's reauthorization earlier, you could see that reauthorization bill kind of saying, okay, we're going to wind down the current map before 2028. Everything will still be eligible that's already gone in, but a new map will be effective as of this date. So that won't happen for a couple years. So you're right now just focus on the zones you have.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you again, everyone. Thank you for your feedback in the chat box. We really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining, and we hope this was helpful. Please send us any feedback and look out for a follow-up email with all the information we mentioned shortly. Thanks again.
Thanks all.